So after discussing the early forms and practices of psychological testing and measurement way back from Han and Song dynasty in China, we also have Galen describing how scaling method in psychology started, as well as the attempt to practice phrenology and physiognomy in the field of psychology. Now we will now discuss some aspect of psychology, namely the experimental psychology, which flourished in around 1800s in continental Europe and Great Britain. So way back then, in pursuing measure of human abilities, all right. Individuals were tested in laboratories with objective procedures that were capable of replication. As we may know it nowadays, these measurements will try to produce consistent and reliable results. But experimental psychology mistook simple sensory processes for intelligence. So the scientists way back then used different brass instruments to measure sensory thresholds and reaction times, thinking that such abilities were intelligent. So let us start with Wilhelm Wundt, who founded the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig in 1879. So he is known as the father of modern psychology, and he believed that speed of thought differed from one person to another. So this contribution affected pioneering scientific management, other measurement of psychology. So through his students, such as Edward Titchener, we also have James Cattell, we also have Charles Spearman, Granville, Stanley Hall, and many others who uh, tend to affect the way we manage psychology and we treat psychology as science nowadays. So we also have Francis Galton. Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's half cousin. So Galton was obsessed with measurements such that individual differences can be objectively measured. So can you relate with this one on why we are conducting surveys, research measurements, and other statistical procedures in psychology? So maybe we are conducting quantitative researches and make sense of these numerical data to interpret them later on and try to correlate them with other assessment tools such as projective techniques, interviews, and observations. All right. So his study on intelligence was more focused on eugenics. If you're familiar with this one, it is focused on improving the physical and mental constructs of human species by selected parenthood. So you can just Google it and you may also know the effects of this movement. So this type of study tend to influence some movements which may lead to racism and the like. Okay, so you can also research on that. Now, Galton continued the tradition of brass instruments with data collection from hundreds, if not thousands, of subjects. So his method on tests and measures involved both physical and behavioral domains. So in the present practice of psychology, most psychology practitioners are more focusing not only on the numerical results, okay, of the objective test, but also on the qualitative data gathered through observation, interviews, and the like. So with this, he generally demonstrated that objective tests could be utilized and that scores could be obtained through standardized procedures. Okay, let's go back with Wilhelm Wundt's students. We have Edward Bradford Titchener. So Titchener established the school of thought, what we call the structuralism. Structuralism is a school of thought in psychology that tries to identify mental processes into most basic components. So researchers try to understand the basic elements of consciousness using method known as the introspection. So structuralism is more on the structure of the mind and consciousness. On the other hand, we also have functionalism, which tries to understand the purpose of the said factors. We also have James Cattell. So James Cattell studied the new experimental psychology with both Wundt and Galton before setting at Columbia University, where for 26 years he was undisputed dean of American psychology. So Cattell wanted to study individual differences. So he invented the term mental test. We also have Charles Spearman. So he is known for the general intelligence, also known for the G factor. It refers to general mental ability that, according to him, it underlies multiple and specific skills, including your verbal, spatial, numerical, and mechanical as well. To identify these factors, Spearman used factor analysis. So he is the proponent of the factor analysis. So this statistical method, the factor analysis, is also used in constructing the tests such as Raymond Cattell's 16PF and Costa and McCrae's NeoPi. Okay, so you can research on that as well. We also have Granville Stanley Hall. So he became the very first president of American Psychological Association. He influenced the early development of psychology in US. So he suggested that studies on adolescents could contribute to the evolution of the race if properly administered. Now, if you want to conduct research on adolescents, there are several factors that you might consider, such as their age, physiological and psychological activities that might be happening with the adolescents, and several other factors related to this age bracket. So aside from these individuals, we also have notable psychology practitioners such as Carl Pearson. So can you hear his name in statistics? Maybe he is very familiar, right? So we also have Alfred Binet, Victor Henry, Emil Kraepelin, Clark Whistler, and Leitner Whitmer, for example. We have Carl Pearson. So Carl Pearson developed the statistical techniques such as the chi-square test. We also have the standard deviation, right? So familiar, and correlation regression coefficients. So these techniques obviously is widely used in not just in psychology practice, but also in different fields of expertise, which may require a scientific approach to the inquiry and decision making in a company, for example. So we may discuss these statistical methods in other forms of our presentation. We also have Alfred Binet. So Alfred Binet research included the measurement of the individual differences. So the reaction times, also the association of auditory times with specific colors, auditory and visual imagery, and children's memory capability. So in his early research, Binet also investigated children's fears. Okay, so also known as the severe criticism, the methods of experimental psychology. Okay, for its sterile laboratory conditions. So he is likely against that kind of practice. So along with these studies, he is also associated with Victor Henry. So maybe you're familiar with Victor Henry with your chemistry class. So he initiated his work on measuring individual differences as well and took into account both quantitative and qualitative aspects of individuals' response. Also, aside from psychological factors to be measured, there are also medical practitioners way back then that realized how physiological aspects should be taken into account, okay, with the manifestation of some mental illnesses. For example, we have clinical observations of Emil Kraepelin. Now, Emil Kraepelin led his hypothesis that there are specific combinations of symptoms, mostly biological in nature, in relation to the course of psychiatric illnesses. Take note of this. Kraepelin is a psychiatrist. So he is merging the results of psychological assessments into his observations in psychiatric clinics. So that allow one to identify a particular mental disorder. With this, he began to have an insight how psychological assessment works, and also this practice is obviously applied nowadays. So in the field of psychiatry, we may also know that physicians have to rule out diseases if some symptoms occurring in a client is are obvious. So some illnesses may be caused by organic factors and not by merely psychological factors. So nowadays, physicians may refer to guidelines such as Diagnostic Statistical Manual and ICD. So to identify what symptoms are showing to a client which may be qualified to a certain disease. So also medical practitioners back then realized that some of those psychiatric impairment had reversible illnesses that did not necessarily imply diminished intellect, whereas those mental retardation showed a greater development continuity and has something to do with impaired intellect. So aside from clinical setting and assessment, there are also scientists such as Clark Whistler who contested the method of intelligence testing based on psychophysical measurements. So particularly with Francis Galton's work on eugenics. So Whistler questioned how Cattell and Galton conduct measurement of intelligence and mental ability by means of measuring the reaction times, movement times, and other simple mental and sensory processes. Now, Whistler showed that there was no statistical correlation between the psychophysical scores and the academic grades of those participants. Okay, so he suggested that such methodology in measuring intelligence seem to be invalid. All right, we will discuss in a separate discussion video discussion the characteristics of good tests to describe what valid and reliable test means. So we also have the important contribution of Leitner Whitmer, who contributed the term clinical psychology. So he is the one who contributed this term. So across his field of expertise with educational experiments as well as clinical psychology, he suggested that clinical psychology has to utilize statistical and clinical methods to investigate the mental retardation or moral retardation. Now, he also suggested that facilities for clinical psychology should be established. And of course, we have to bring some opportunities to those children who are suffering with this kind of illnesses, the mental retardation, okay, which inhibit them to progress likely to their academics, okay, and in life as general. Okay, so now let me ask you this. What are your plans in the near future? Do you wish to fulfill Leitner Whitmer's proposals, or would you want to discover some discrepancies with the practice of psychological testing? Now it is all up to you, and I wish you all the best, whether you will pursuing career in school or in industry or in clinical setting. All right. So a newfound humanism, let's go back with clinical setting, began to influence the social practices towards individuals who are suffering with intellectual disabilities and psychological disabilities. With this, humanism there arose a greater interest in diagnostic and mental retardation. At the beginning of 19th century, okay, many physicians had begun to perceive the difference between mental retardation and mental illnesses. Now, Esquirol, as you can see right here, was the first to formalize the difference in writing. So he proposed the first classification system in mental retardation, and language skills were the main diagnostic criteria. So in line with this, we have Philip Pinel, often said to be the father of modern clinical psychiatry. So he advocated humanitarian methods in the treatment of the mentally ill and for the development of the mode of psychological therapy known as the moral treatment. So this is how some of the important personalities in the field of testing and assessment built the practice of psychology during this time. So in the next lecture, we will discuss some of the cultural considerations and ethical guidelines and existing laws that we will consider in terms of psychological testing and assessment. So as you can see right here, it may be include the following. So we have the APE Code of Conduct, PAP Code of Conduct, Mental Health Act or the Republic Act of 11036, and we also have the Philippine Psychology Act of 2009 or RA 10029. Okay, so we also have these principles of APA, the PAP, and also the ethical codes, the ethics code based on the assessment are being used by psychologists. So we will discuss this one day. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in the next video.